The ground does not have to split open to change a city. Sometimes it only shivers. A cup rattles against a saucer, a lamp sways half an inch, a train slows. Phones light up with a warning that gives people 10 seconds, maybe 5, maybe none. In some parts of the world, that is not a rare interruption. It is part of the background. The Earth is constantly releasing stress along broken seams in its crust, and a few countries sit directly on those seams, where the pressure never really stops building. What makes those places different is not only the size of the disasters that make international news, it is the repetition. Small quakes, moderate quakes, deep quakes, offshore quakes, aftershock sequences that can last for months. The shaking becomes part geology, part engineering, part habit. Whole cities are designed around the expectation that the ground may move under them many times within a single lifetime. Streets, bridges, pipelines, schools, hospitals, and apartment towers all carry that assumption inside their design. When you look closely, the planet's most restless zones are not just places where earthquakes happen. They are places where civilization has learned to negotiate with motion. Japan is one of the clearest examples. It sits near the meeting zones of several major plates, including the Pacific Plate and the Philippine Sea Plate, both of which are being forced beneath neighboring crust. That tectonic arrangement loads the region with frequent earthquakes, from small offshore tremors to giant subduction events. The country records enormous numbers of earthquakes in part because it lies in an intensely active zone, and in part because it has one of the densest seismic monitoring networks on Earth. In practical terms, that means shaking is not an occasional surprise. It is something measured, mapped, drilled for, and expected. Tokyo shows what that expectation does to urban life. Buildings are not simply made stronger in the old sense, with thicker walls and heavier frames. Many are made smarter. Engineers use seismic isolation, energy dissipation devices, flexible structural systems, and detailed connection design so the building can move without failing. The Japan Meteorological Agency's early warning system, launched for the public in 2007, detects the first fast seismic waves and sends alerts before the stronger shaking arrives, sometimes giving only seconds. That small window is enough for trains to slow, factory lines to stop, elevators to pause at floors, and millions of people to brace. Then there is Indonesia, stretched across one of the busiest tectonic belts on the planet. USGS notes that while Japan locates the most earthquakes, Indonesia likely has the most in total, because it is larger and also sits in an extremely active seismic zone. Sumatra, Java, Sulawesi, the Banda Arc, the Molucca Sea region, all of it is shaped by subduction, collision, and faulting. The 2004 Sumatra-Andaman earthquake made this region famous for catastrophic reasons. But the deeper truth is that the archipelago lives with constant seismic motion even when the rest of the world is not watching. In many Indonesian cities, the question is not whether the ground will shake again. It is what kind of shaking the next event will bring. That has huge consequences for places like Padang, Banda Aceh, and parts of Java. Indonesian risk is not just about buildings collapsing. It is also about where cities sit relative to steep slopes, soft coastal deposits, and tsunami exposure. A strong offshore quake can arrive as a structural problem, a slope failure problem, and a coastal evacuation problem all at once. Planning in such regions means wider evacuation thinking, vertical evacuation structures in some coastal zones, and repeated public drills because dense population and short warning times do not leave room for improvisation. A city near a subduction trench has to think in layers. Turkey lives with a different style of danger. Much of the country is stressed by the motion of the Anatolian microplate between Eurasia, Arabia, and Africa, and the North Anatolian Fault is one of the most important strike-slip fault systems in the world. It carries right lateral motion on the order of roughly 23 to 24 millimeters per year in places, and its western reach runs beneath or near the Sea of Marmara, close to Istanbul. That matters because Istanbul is one of the world's great cities, dense, historic, and threaded with infrastructure, yet it sits near a seismic gap where researchers have long watched for a major rupture. You can feel the planning problem immediately. Old masonry districts, modern towers, bridges, ports, gas lines, hospitals, schools, and crowded apartment blocks all coexist in the same metropolitan region. After destructive earthquakes such as Izmit in 1999 and the Kahramanmaraş sequence in 2023, Turkey's building performance became a public question, not just an engineering one. Seismic codes exist, monitoring systems exist, and AFAD operates national earthquake observation and loss estimation tools. But shaking exposes more than geology. It exposes construction quality, enforcement, retrofit delays, and the cost of letting vulnerable buildings remain in place. In earthquake country, the code on paper is only half the story. California has its own version of this negotiation with the ground. The San Andreas fault system is not a single neat crack, but a long, complex zone of motion with branching faults such as the San Jacinto, Banning, Hayward, and Calaveras. In the Bay Area, the Hayward Fault is especially watched because it cuts through heavily urbanized terrain and has produced major historic earthquakes, including the 1868 event. Some segments also creep, slipping slowly at the surface, which can damage curbs, pipes, and walls even without a major quake. So the state does not merely prepare for one cinematic rupture. It prepares for a whole family of failure modes. That changes the architecture of everyday life from Los Angeles to Oakland. In California, seismic retrofitting is a giant industry because many older soft-story apartments, unreinforced masonry buildings, and brittle concrete structures were never designed for modern shaking demands. FEMA guidance and state programs focus on identifying specific weaknesses like poor anchorage, weak first floors, irregular shapes, and failing connections. At the same time, Shake Alert now serves more than 50 million residents and visitors across the U.S. West Coast, with California users receiving warnings through apps and public alert systems seconds before strong shaking is expected. That does not stop earthquakes, but it changes response time from zero to something usable. Chile may be the most instructive country on Earth when it comes to large earthquake survival through engineering. And the entire Chilean margin is defined by the Nazca Plate diving beneath South America along a subduction zone that runs for more than 7,000 kilometers. This is the same tectonic system that has produced some of the largest earthquakes ever recorded, including the 1960 Valdivia event, still the largest instrumentally measured earthquake at magnitude 9.5. Strong shaking is not an outlier there. It is part of national memory. Cities such as Santiago, Concepcion, and Valparaiso show what long experience can do. Chile is often described as highly seismic but comparatively resilient because its building practices and code development have been shaped by repeated major events. Engineers there pay close attention to reinforced concrete behavior, ductility, confinement, and how structural systems absorb and redistribute energy. That does not mean Chile avoids damage. It means that in many modern urban areas, a severe earthquake is more likely to produce repairable damage and controlled failure patterns than blanket collapse. In seismic design, that difference is enormous. It is the difference between a city that survives its own geography and one that does not. Mexico adds another complication. It is not just seismically active because of one plate boundary. USGS notes that Mexico sits at the intersection of four major plates: the North American, Pacific, Caribbean, and Cocos plates. That complexity creates different types of earthquakes in different parts of the country. Along the Pacific side, the Cocos plate subducts beneath the continent and produces major offshore and near-coast events. Farther inland, the same earthquake can become a completely different threat depending on what a city is built on. Mexico City is the classic case. Much of the city sits on ancient lakebed sediments, and those soft deposits can strongly amplify shaking, especially at certain frequencies. That is one reason the 1985 earthquake caused severe damage in the capital, even though the rupture was roughly 300 kilometers away on the Pacific coast. It is also why later earthquakes continued to reveal a strange urban pattern, where some blocks are hit hard, while others nearby fare much better. In Mexico City, seismic risk is not only about magnitude and distance, it is about resonance, basin effects, soil behavior, and building height lining up in the worst possible way. That is also why early warning became so important there. Mexico's seismic system has operated for about 3 decades, recording thousands of earthquakes and broadcasting alerts when thresholds are met. In some cases, the warning can reach Mexico City before the strongest shaking arrives, because the sensors are closer to the coast where large subduction events begin. Those extra seconds have become part of public life. Sirens sound, traffic pauses, classrooms react, offices move away from glass, and the city rehearses the difference between panic and procedure. New Zealand lives on a plate boundary so varied that it almost reads like a tectonics textbook. USGS and GNS describe a region with the Alpine Fault crossing South Island, the Hikurangi subduction zone off the east, the Poisoger subduction zone to the southwest, and major transform motion connecting it all. Since 1900, the broader New Zealand region has recorded numerous earthquakes above magnitude 7.5. The 2016 Kaikoura earthquake showed how complicated rupture can be there, jumping across multiple faults in a way that challenged simple models of how one event should behave. The planning response in New Zealand is unusually explicit. The Building Act divides the country into high, medium, and low seismic risk areas, and those classifications affect how quickly potentially earthquake-prone buildings must be identified, strengthened, or removed. Engineers also work with detailed geotechnical guidance because slope failure, retaining wall behavior, liquefaction, and ground deformation can be just as destructive as the shaking itself. In Wellington or Christchurch, earthquake safety is not buried in technical appendices. It is built into timelines, illegal duties, property assessments, and public debate over what older buildings are allowed to remain standing. Nepal brings the story up into the mountains. The Himalaya exists because the India plate continues to push into Eurasia, shortening and thickening the crust. That same collision produces large thrust earthquakes along the main Himalayan fault system. The 2015 Gorkha earthquake, magnitude 7.8, struck about 82 kilometers northwest of Kathmandu, and a major aftershock followed on May 12th. USGS described the main event as thrust faulting on or near the interface between the under-thrusting India plate and the overriding Eurasian plate. In plain language, the mountain belt is still being built, and that process stores dangerous strain. What makes Nepal especially important in this story is the interaction between seismic hazard and building stock. In many towns and villages, traditional masonry and non-engineered construction proved highly vulnerable. Reconstruction programs after 2015 therefore focused not only on replacing homes, but on rebuilding them with better detailing, improved materials, and safer practices that households could actually use. This is where earthquake planning becomes very practical. It is not always about expensive high-rise technology. Sometimes it is about how stones are tied, how roofs are supported, how walls are confined, and whether a family house can remain standing long enough for the people inside to get out. Greece is the most seismically active part of Europe, largely because of the Hellenic Arc and the broader interaction between the African plate, the Aegean region, and Western Turkey. South of Crete, the eastern Mediterranean seafloor is subducting beneath the Aegean at rates measured in centimeters per year, while extension in the back arc and active faulting across the Aegean create frequent earthquakes. That is why Greece experiences regular shaking across islands in mainland fault zones, from the Ionian region to the Dodecanese. The country's hazard is spread out, maritime, and persistent. For Greek cities and towns, that means balancing history with safety. Many communities sit among old masonry buildings, narrow streets, ports, and dense tourist infrastructure. Retrofitting is often more difficult where architecture is older and heritage value is high. You cannot treat a centuries-old urban fabric the same way you treat a new business district. So earthquake planning there often involves compromises between preservation and structural intervention, alongside frequent public familiarity with small to moderate tremors that would feel unusual in much of Europe. In Greece, the shaking is not exotic, it is regional reality. Iran is another place where the crust rarely rests for long. The collision of Arabia with Eurasia shortens and deforms a vast zone that includes the Zagros, Alborz, and other mountain belts. USGS notes that this collision drives crustal shortening in northern Iran, as well as active faulting across the broader region, and damaging earthquakes occur in both thrust and strike-slip settings. Unlike a simple plate boundary drawn as one clean line, when Iran's seismic danger is distributed across a broad, deforming belt. That makes hazard mapping and urban planning more complicated, because risk is spread through multiple active structures and varied building conditions. Tehran sits near major faults and in the shadow of the Alborz Mountains, which is not the combination you want in a megacity. Add old neighborhoods, dense population, transport systems, gas networks, and vulnerable buildings, and the problem becomes obvious. A city does not need daily destructive earthquakes to be shaped by seismic risk. Repeated smaller events, regional seismicity, and the known possibility of a larger rupture are enough to influence codes, emergency planning, land use, and how infrastructure is prioritized. In earthquake country, uncertainty itself becomes part of governance. If you step back, a pattern emerges. The places where Earth shakes all the time are not all dealing with the same mechanism. Japan, Chile, and much of Indonesia face major subduction threats. Turkey and California are dominated by major strike-slip systems. Nepal and Iran are driven by continental collision. Greece and New Zealand combine several tectonic styles across compact geography. Mexico mixes plate interactions with extreme local soil amplification. The cause changes from place to place, but the urban answer is surprisingly consistent. Build lighter when possible. Build ductile. Tie the structure together. Respect the soil. Retrofit the old stock. Protect lifelines. Drill the population. Use early warning if you can. Design for movement, not for the fantasy of total stillness. That may be the most important point of all. An earthquake is a geological event, but a disaster is filtered through planning. The same amount of shaking does not produce the same result everywhere. One city loses bridges, another keeps them open. One block collapses, another sways and survives. One school empties in 30 seconds because the students have practiced, another freezes because nobody has. The restless parts of the world have learned this lesson repeatedly, sometimes at terrible cost. Their streets, codes, and routines are proof that when the ground never fully settles, human systems have to become flexible enough to live on a moving planet. Be curious and always seek to learn something new. Subscribe and see for yourself. Thanks for watching.